Welcome to TrulyFit.
Don, welcome back to the TrulyFit Podcast. For those who have not heard you on the first time around, why don't you give my listeners a little updates and bio of who you are and what you do day to day in the fitness and health industry?
Sure, thanks. So my background is I'm trained as an exercise physiologist. I grew up on a farm in Eastern Ohio, and when I was a decent high school wrestler, my parents said, "You're going to college," so I had every intention of going back home and feeding beef cattle for the rest of my life. But I walked on the wrestling team at Ohio State. I was decent. I wasn't good, but I was able to walk on. So I get on the wrestling team. I struggle with injury. I was a big weight cutter. I was one of those guys that would cut weight from like 230 to 177, and struggled with a lot of injuries at that time. And as I looked for answers on how to do what I need to do to compete, I fell in love with human physiology. And had an ag econ class as a sophomore that basically said, unless you're inheriting a farm, you're screwed. So I was like, okay, this makes this decision pretty easy. Changed over my academics at that time, finished up my graduate work after I got done wrestling. I went to grad school and studied exercise phys, strength and conditioning, and have been in practice ever since. Along the way, I've been a professor for 25 of the last 35 years, teaching the exercise sciences, but I've always kept a stable of athletes I work with. I've always kept a group. The latest that I really had hands-on with, 15 through 18, I was a sports scientist with the wrestling program at Ohio State. Built a data system that we were harvesting about 3.5 million data points a season on a wrestling team. And we got to where we could make good decisions based on, what makes a difference. What makes, we took our team and we broke them into a group of three cohorts. One cohort was All-American or better. And the language to our team was, if you're on this team and you make the starting lineup, we expect you to be an All-American. So that's really what the goal was. So we had a group of, I think it was 9 guys that were anywhere from 6 in the country to an Olympic gold medalist. So, a pretty interesting group. We had a second group that was, these were athletes who had started for us, but never made All-American for some reason. And then we had a third group that had never started for us. But these athletes all trained together. They all worked out together. They all did their thing. So we wanted to, with this data, we wanted to say, okay, what really makes a difference? What really gives the athlete the ability to move from, not able to make the starting lineup to making the starting lineup to actually becoming an All-American. And, so that was an incredibly informative opportunity for me. And we make decisions based on the data. And I think this is really important as we start to look at things like TrulyFit, what really makes a difference, and what is dogma? What is the residue of just years and years of dogmatic practice. I tell the story. My last teaching job, I was in this little small school in Western Ohio, and one of my students, we had this advanced performance course that we were teaching, and it was a capstone course. And one of my students, we're talking about philosophies and so forth, and this kid goes, "Well, I'm a Westside guy." And Westside Barbell is a big powerlifting facility, and I said, that's great. And I said, that's good. I said, just know that whether you're West Side or you're HIT or you're whatever, fill in the blank. I said, this is the same as Baptist and Methodist. Okay. You read from the same book. Okay. You've decided that there's some practices that you execute that gives you the ability to build your own sanctuary. But those are dogmatic differences. They're not scientific differences. And so this is, when we start looking at things like TrulyFit, what really is a differentiating factor? So that's, as my career has evolved over the years, I started training my first client who went on to become a national champion in wrestling in 1987. That was my first paid personal training gig. Shortly thereafter, I was doing work with the Chicago Bulls and Al Vermeil out of the Bulls organization, and just have worked my way through that for the, and to the point now that I'm doing a lot of consulting, working with people, helping athletes understand, what really makes a difference. And it's not about my program. It's about what does the data say as it relates to what really makes a difference in you achieving your goals.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of psychological barriers too, because naturally people gravitate, Don, as you may agree with this, towards what they're good at. So what happens is, you
Yes.
might be a Westside Barbell guy because your body type allows you to do that particular type of training in a better way than, let's say, yoga, right? And you might be a yoga person
Right.
because you're born with the mobility and flexibility to go ahead and do that. So that's why the data is so important, because the data will take away that psychological barrier, correct? And just say, this is what you need. This is what your body is lacking.
Yeah. What's ironic about that is my Olympic gold medalist. His name was Kyle Snyder. Kyle is just an amazing athlete, but we have a distinct. One of the things that we identified in wrestling is cardiovascular fitness is critical in an athlete's ability to move from Group C to Group B to Group A. It's the strongest predictor of success of any of those three groups. And Kyle was an incredibly powerful athlete. But we did a lot of threshold work. We had bikes that I could program wattage on, and we would do what's called 2x15 intervals. So there are 15-minute intervals at a given wattage, and then we used heart rate as a secondary indicator. If we kept them in zone 3 where I wanted them, it was a great workout. But Kyle hated those workouts. He just hated them. And I said, Kyle, I know you hate them, but this is the weak spot. This is the opportunity for you to improve. I think our challenge is that how do we effectively help athletes recognize where these weak spots are? Because, I do a lot of work, Steve, I have a model, and in fact, I'll send you a graphic of it that we can put in the show notes and so forth. But I call it my performance pyramid, and it's a pyramid. There's 3 sides. There's physiological, there's psychological, and there's skills. Those are the 3 sides of the pyramid. And each side has a number of factors. There's 10 elements on the 3 sides. Okay, and what I say to people is that when you look at those elements, you win on your strength, but you lose on your weakness. And so you can be the strongest athlete in the world, but if you don't have enough gas to get to the end of your competition, you're going to get beat. You can be a strong athlete with great cardio, but if you don't have the right mindset going in, you're not going to be able to compete. And oh, by the way, if you're a college athlete and you don't have the skills to get your ass to class and turn in exams and do the work to remain eligible, you don't get a chance to compete. So I don't care how strong you are or how good your mindset is, if you don't have the basic life skills to get things done. So when I work with an athlete, I typically go back and I look at that performance pyramid. What are the 10 factors? Where do we need to focus on? Because I think you invest in your weakness and you support your strength. But we've all got to figure out what that weakness is.
Yeah, and you think for athletes it would be easy to convey, but it's not. So, in sports themselves, there's so many different components that you need to be good at, right? So for wrestling, I'm not a wrestler, but I follow wrestling. How good are you from the bottom? How good are you riding? How good is your, ability to sprawl? How good is your ability to take down, right? So if you can look at those things independently and go, you know what, I've done everything pretty well this season, except my single leg is weakening. All I can do is use the double leg for takedowns. I need to work on my single leg. Well, we can break that same sort of thing down in fitness and health, right? From cardiovascular component to overall strength, absolutely, to endurance, to whatever those are, right? So we break those down categorically.
And let me give you a concrete example, and it's my example. So, again, decent high school wrestler. I showed up for practice. I worked hard. Once I quit cutting weight and started to get strong, all of a sudden I go from a guy who can't get out of the training room to I was in the starting lineup. So just by making that decision to stop cutting weight and start training differently, I had a big jump. Now, that first year I was in the starting lineup, my record was 6-12. Won 6 matches, lost 12. Of the 12 matches I lost, I was winning 11 of them when I got pinned. I couldn't get off the bottom. So that summer, I went to a wrestling camp out in Eastern Virginia called the Granby School of Wrestling. And Granby is a bottom wrestling school. And I developed the bottom skills. So I go from 6-12 to 39-9. Just by eliminating the weakness of not being able to get off the bottom. I became unrideable, and all of a sudden I become competitive at a national level. Now, the ironic part about that 39-9, of the 9 losses, 7 of them took place in a dual meet situation in our home arena in St. John Arena. I couldn't lose on the road, and I couldn't win at home. And so I started, we had a sports psychologist come talk to our team, and I started, and they asked this question. They said, how many of you would rather train than compete? My hand went up. I love to train. Back then, competition was really rough on me. And we identified that I had a situation where I was very anxious, because when we wrestled at home was the only time my parents got to come see me wrestle. And we were just talking about your second child's on the way, and now you're into this parenthood game. If your kid's walking into the living room from the kitchen with a bowl of cereal and you say, don't spill that, well, you can count on about 3 steps later it hitting the grounds. Okay. Because we call it the pink elephant, don't think about this. So I worked with a sports psychologist to deal, and he pointed this out to me. He said, so your parents are there. So what's going through your mind? Don't lose. And I lost, for something I locked up. And he said, you can't not think about that thing. You can't not think about the pink elephant. All you can do is, we deal with pink elephants with what I call yellow squirrels. So my mindset at this point is about, I've done the work, I've lifted the weights, I'm as good as this person. So positive affirmations. And I had a mantra that would go through my mind before every match. I developed this mantra. So all of a sudden I didn't have pink elephants anymore. I had a brain full of yellow squirrels. I was able to get into flow. I was able to, turn off that prefrontal cortex, disconnect it, and wound up being very successful that year. So this is when we go back to the model that we discussed. You got to figure out what that weakness is. When you figure out what that weakness is, you train it, you bring it up. In management, we call it constraint management. There's a big fancy term for it. You can study this at Stanford. Constraint management, and that's all we're doing in athletics.
Yeah, turning things to your subconscious sometimes is also important. People are overthinking the process, right? You may have sprawled 3,000 times in practice and no one can take you down, but for whatever reason, you're overthinking how you're dropping your hips backwards as the person is shooting when you're in the moment, and you're not able to do it with the speed and precision as you usually are. So, for putting, I'm a golfer. I'll count to 10 while I'm putting. So I'm not thinking about my putting stroke. I saw the hole. I know where I want to hit it. I've had 1,000 putts before. In my brain, I start counting to 10. So I'm focused on the counting. And then I just let my body subconsciously hit the putt. And it's really helped me. I've been doing that for the last year. So it is funny how you can really trick yourself into becoming more successful in a sport.
Yeah. And if you're thinking in the sport, you're losing. I saw an interesting post on Instagram earlier today talking about this, is that we spend all this time practicing to wire in these lower levels at the basal motor level, at the motor level. And when you step onto the field, when you step onto the arena, it's critical for success that you're able to wipe everything away and stop thinking and just react. And I think it's a mistake for coaches or parents to tell an athlete to think during an event. If you're thinking, you're losing. You've got to get to where you've wired this in and you're reacting. That's what great athletes do.
Yeah, I had a coach in football who said, "When you think, you stink." Obviously, not that innovative of a line, but it made sense. And you see that a lot when people change up their format too much. So you'll see teams who, getting into football here, they always run cover 2. And that's basically all they do. There may be some cover 2, cover 3. And then they switch to man. Well, it's of course, it's good to switch things up, but the problem is your guys have gone from this instinctual, I have this area, I run to this area, I cover this area, and now I'm thinking of a totally different process. So as much as it is to switch things up, as good as it can be from a, let's say, a strategic level, you're also putting a psychological load on your athletes who now have to be in that thinking zone rather than that instinctual zone.
Or the other side of that is, Steve, is you've got to practice the transition. Okay, this is part of preparing that team so that they have worked through this transition from zone to man. It happens automatically. That they're not thinking. They just kick in a different set of skills that they've wired in prior. So if you're going to do that, you have to practice it, and you have to practice it at a high level many times so you can do that transition.
Touche. That makes sense. If you think about all of the lapses that you've seen over the years in sports, you wonder how many of those come from exactly what you just said, right? There hasn't been that practicing of that transition, right? They had that other thing in place, whatever that thing was, but it wasn't practiced to the point where it was secondary and every single person was overthinking once the coach or the situation changed drastically.
Yeah. Overthinking, creating stress. I had a teammate that when we started the HRV work at Ohio State with the athletes, we kept he kept coming back to this, is that, you only have stress when you're regret of the past or fear of the future. Okay. When you're present, you have no stress when you're here. And this is the reason a lot of these things like meditation and these practices are so valuable. Back in the early 80s, we called it visualization. So as I was preparing for a match, I wasn't visualizing wrestling. I was visualizing the walk up a hill back on the farm I grew up on. I was becoming present. I was getting rid of the past. I wasn't anticipating the future. I wasn't thinking about winning or losing. I was using mantras to affirm the fact that I belonged there. And those mantras, creating that repetitive process, again, it's that, I don't know, I'm a huge fan of the psychological concept of flow, the psychology of the optimum experience. The book is called, that's the name of the book that I originally read. I think it's one of the most important books I ever read. But now Steven Kotler is an author. He's written The Rise of Superman and Stealing Fire. He's really, and they're excellent books. But it's the process for disconnecting the prefrontal cortex, because that prefrontal cortex is where stress lives. It's where all those thoughts come from. And this is where meditation, visualization, all these techniques can become very, very valuable. So when you have an athlete that is struggling in competition, great practice athlete, but struggling in competition, that's probably where it's happening. They're not able to drop into flow. They're not able to separate and get into the point in time that they're at, so they stop thinking and begin reacting and doing the things that they can do naturally.
You'd hope that was addressed earlier. I know in your case it was. We all know those people, and I happen to be one of those in basketball specifically, where in practice, you are the best player. Anybody can walk into a practice and see who the best player is on the team. And then in the game, it doesn't come to fruition, right? You can see that that person is not presenting on the court as if they did in practice. And so much of it is obviously psychological, not physiological. Of course, there's components of both, but they don't have that at lower levels, right? Unless you're a top elite level athlete, right? And your parents are pushing you towards something, they don't have that sort of help for a general high school athlete. Do you think it should be in there? Should they start pushing these people in let's say, in high school athletes to have someone to rely on?
Listen, I think when you take on the responsibility to be a coach, I believe that goes with the responsibility of being a coach. And this can be a challenge because, a lot of times, listen, what do we pay people to coach teams in high school? $3,000-4,000. They're usually teachers. It's usually, it's rough, and it's rough. Okay. So I don't want to criticize coaches for not, digging in enough, but sure. What's changed is that we now live in a time, listen, Steve, can you imagine you and I hearing a podcast on this 20 or 30 years ago, and in my case, 40 years ago? No, I was lucky enough to come across a great sports psychologist back then. And I was blessed. It was an absolute blessing to me. And I think this is part of my responsibility. You always want to pay forward. You know, the Woody Hayes statement, always pay forward. You win with people and you got to pay forward. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. And hopefully along the way it catches and the universe puts people together that need to be together. But I do know if your objective is to be the best you possibly can be, it goes back to that performance triangle. You have to address all 10 elements on there. And if you don't, there's a weakness, and that's how you lose with your weakness, you win with your strength.
Let's talk about some of the physiological things on that performance metric you're talking about from just a recovery standpoint. What are the things that matter in recovery? How do you measure them? And then also, if you can add this at the end, what is the difference between someone like me, maybe I lift 4 or 5 days a week, go on a run, that I should be looking at compared to the elite level athletes? Do we all look at the same metrics, or should I not be as concerned?
No, I don't think you look at the same metrics, and I think intensity is how the intensity that you look at metrics changes from elite performer, Olympic athlete to Joe Bag of Donuts, just trying to increase longevity and improve life. Sure. When I look at that physiological side of the triangle, I look at 4 elements. Number one is movement. That if I want to become a better athlete or a better human, I start by moving better. Okay. So and it makes no sense to add strength to poor movement. If I've got someone who can't move and I load it with strength, all I do is make strong, bad movement. Improved strength on bad movement will not make good. You've got to make movement first. So you focus on movement, get that first. That's the bottom. That's the way. Then you add strength to that. We add our ability to recruit muscle fiber. We add strength to that. And there's lots of ways to do that. The third element is that you got to be able to produce energy. At the end of the day, the athlete that really is successful is the athlete that can generate the most energy in the period of time that you're competing. If I'm in a 7-minute wrestling match and I can generate 100 kilojoules more than my opponent, I have an advantage. Okay. So your ability to produce energy and you can build energy production. And then finally, the top of that physiological side, I don't call it recovery. I call it resilience. I want to build resilience, and recovery is part of the process of building resilience. So we look at that entire physiological spectrum. So recovery, there's tools that you can use to measure recovery. And this is, I think I used the term earlier. It's called heart rate variability, HRV. This is something that we're seeing emerge in athletics. We see it with like Oura rings or Now watches, or there's other devices out there on the market. Frankly, there's devices out there on the market that I do not recommend. They're basically they're toys. They're not tools. And this is really important, but you can get good tools that give you the ability to measure. And let me put this in a little bit of a perspective. In 2015, for me to measure resilience and recovery with my wrestling team, I had a $7,000 device that I could only measure one athlete at a time. Well, now we can purchase a device on the internet called an Oura ring in the $300 price range. Everyone has access to it, and it is an excellent tool. Okay. So all of a sudden I go from where I can only measure one person at a time to where I can have a data flow of my entire program, which not only do I get good interpersonal comparisons, but I get good intra personnel comparisons, and this is, so more data is always better. And this is how fast it's changing. In basically a decade, I've gone from $7,000, I can only measure one at a time, to $300. And this is Moore's law. This is something we see in technology. Every year it gets twice as fast and half as expensive. But again, the challenge is when you're looking at resilience, you've always got to pay attention to, is my data correct? Am I using do I have a toy or a tool? And this is one of the challenges that we have to deal with.
What have you learned in your years about warm-ups? It's really interesting. Let's take wrestling because I know
Hmm.
that's your sport. I remember watching wrestlers jumping rope, let's say, right before they were about to go into their match, right? Some wrestlers weren't. They were stretching. They were doing different things. To me,
Hmm.
I'm optimal at about a 30-minute warm up at this point in my life. But
Hmm.
10 years ago, I only needed about a 10-minute warm up. The older I've got, the more warm up I need to be in order to give my optimal workouts. It seems like that is such an important part of being able to produce is making sure you haven't overly exerted yourself, but also making sure you have enough juice, so to speak, hopping into a match or whatever it is that you're doing prior to giving it your all.
Yeah, so I think of preparing my metabolism for the challenge that's getting ready to come up. So I think it's a mistake for a wrestler to step out on the mat and not have a full sweat going. I think
Hmm.
you start this warm up, you get it, and I want to have all of my energy systems turned on, from the standpoint that if I'm a football player and I'm going out to play wide receiver or defensive back, my ability to produce maximal speed is based on some energy systems that need to be activated. You need to go out and do a short, this is an oxymoron, a slow sprint, and then you slowly increase the speed. What you're doing there is you're slowly turning on energy systems so that when the game starts and you got to go in that first coverage pattern, you have access to all the energy available from your system. It's turned on. So to answer your question, I think most people do not show up to the event ready. Um, and so
Hmm.
again, I got to the point, I wanted a full sweat going. I wanted to have everything activated, so that when from the first whistle, I was ready to blow this guy up. And okay, so here's now, Steve, we run into a situation with genetics. Okay, I have the genetics for picking up heavy stuff. I'm really good at that, or being very powerful. Um, we have teammates though that I had a teammate, back then, that ran the Columbus Marathon in 2 hours and 30 minutes. Okay, that's a wrestler. Okay, that's borderline a world. That's a national class time. It's certainly a national class time for a wrestler in a marathon. Um, Bobby didn't win matches in the first period. He drug you into the third period, and when he got you into the third period, what they call it, we drug you into deep water, and we finally, drowned you. That's the way he works.
Yeah.
So, we can have different genetic differences. While you and I share the DNA as human males, Homo sapien males, okay, there can be a lot of differentiation. You may have more fast twitch than slow twitch. I have more. There can be what I think this is important in that we're not all the same. Okay, we are, but we're not.
Yeah.
From the standpoint that I think it's a mistake for a coach to take a team and say, "This is my program," and then put that program on
Hmm.
every athlete there. Um, while
Yeah.
we're the same, we do have genetic differences. We do have there's some people that are marathoners, we call them desert people, and there's some people that are very powerful, we call them jungle people. They move in three axes. So and it makes sense, the DNA that we share is probably 1 million years old, depending on the paleontologist that you talk to. But we only have evolution with extinction. Okay, with an extinction event, we'll eliminate a big chunk of DNA, and all of a sudden we'll have an evolved set of DNA. But we haven't had an extinction event in humans for 1 million years. Okay, so in that time, all we have is diversity. So we have lots of diversity. So that's the reason, Steve, one person may be a carnivore and another person's a vegan. One person may focus on cardio, the other one's the strength. All of these advantages also create weaknesses. So this is where a coach or a program can step in and say, okay, where is the weakness? What is our challenge here? And I think this is one of the mistakes that sport make, in the fact that we get hung up in our dogmas. I'm gonna go back to that, is that I'm a Westside guy, I'm a high intensity guy, I'm a this, I'm a that. Well, I don't give a shit what you are as a coach. what I care about is that athletes need to adapt, and how can we best trigger that athlete to adapt with the least amount of work in order to get the trigger so that I have extra energy left for all the things I need for them. For athletes, their biggest challenge is training, competing, and staying healthy. Injury is what ends a career. Injury is what causes you not to miss your goals. So we've got to get to where we're able to use the minimum effective dose on everything that we do, because we're in the weight room, we're doing conditioning, we're on the field, we're doing the homework on our own. We're asking a lot for these kids, and then we're probably over competing them as well, which is a whole nother issue. But this is the challenge from a leadership standpoint. Steve, we've all been part of teams, and we go out and we perform on a team. When we do it, there'll be a group of athletes that will excel. Okay. And they'll be fine. There's a group in the middle, and then there's a group that can't get out of the training room. Okay. What is the difference? What makes those people different? Well, I think there's a lot of things. I think when you look at resiliency and stress, and there's supplements that we can use to improve this. I think this concept of stem cells is absolutely intriguing. Okay. When I look at what separates that athlete's ability to exceed, there certainly can be androgens on top of this. There are people that have naturally higher testosterone levels than others. They have a competitive advantage because that's the science of muscle growth and remodeling. Well, we can short circuit that to a certain degree with some stem cell supplements and some things like that. So that can create an advantage, but we've got to identify it first. Why can't this athlete get out of the training room?
Yeah, well said. And there's always coaches who try to fit the players to their model. And then you have the opposite. They're coaches that develop models around their individual players. But ultimately, absolutely, I do think the athlete needs to take some autonomy over themselves, because like we just talked about, there might be a particular warm-up that the wrestling team does in practice. Now, the coach can't make up 26 different warm-ups if you have a big team. No. But that doesn't mean you can't have done your warm-up in advance, right? So maybe you go and do your own thing 10 or 15 minutes prior to practice because you think you need more warm-up.
That is spot on. And that doesn't just apply to warm-up. That applies to the entire training portfolio. Okay. Again, back in my example, we had a strength coach at Ohio State in 1980. He came in 1978. We had a strength coach. Our team went over and lifted. It became clear to me that I needed more. Okay. And I talk about Westside. I had a teammate whose roommate, the guy's name was Kevin Akins. He had the third longest shot in the world at the time. He could chuck a shot put 72 feet. This dude was huge. And I'm over at his apartment one night, and he says, "You want to get strong? I'll show you where you get strong." So he takes me to Lou Simmons's garage, the original Westside. Okay, so that's where that was one of my original learning spaces, and not only that, but I also had a mentor who was connected with the Nautilus Leverage Group out of Cincinnati, Ohio, which eventually became Hammer Strength. So Greg Jones, Arthur Jones, who invented Nautilus, his son Greg Jones had developed Nautilus Leverage, and then Nautilus Leverage was purchased by Life Fitness and became Hammer Strength. So I'm going down to Cincinnati, working with people down there, looking at this high intensity stuff. I'm going over to the west side of Columbus, working with Lou Simmons, picking up things there. And at the end of the day, Don Moxley developed his own program, okay, that had elements of all of those. And as an athlete, you have to own your process. You just said it a little bit ago. You have to own that. If you want to be great, you have to become an expert in yourself. Okay. You do this with consulting with people, by reaching out, by talking. And again, physiological, psychological, and skills. These are all elements that go part of that, because again, you can be the strongest athlete in the world, but if you can't get your grades, or if you don't know how, one of the things with my college athletes that was really interesting is that, college athlete comes and all of a sudden they have access, they're living in the dorms and they have access to the commons. So their food is prepared for them and they get a pretty good choice of food. So I just have to teach that athlete how to pick the right food. But but most of those athletes will move into an apartment when they're sophomores or juniors. Well, if those athletes do not have the skills to cook, to go to the grocery store, then you wind up eating pizza and wings every night, because that's what DoorDash brings nowadays. So, the skill a lot of times with that athlete, when they move into the apartment, do they have the ability to cook for themselves? When you look at big football programs right now, what you see is these incredible kitchens that are being built into these facilities. So these athletes have prepared food for them that's not in the dorm, but it's now over at the facility, and it's done very well. That's one way to solve that. Not everybody has access to that. So, that's the skill. That's one of the skills. Can I acquire the nutrient dense food sources necessary for me to be able to affect my my physiology and respond and build resiliency from that?
Don, this has been some great information here. I'm sure we'll chat down the road about other things pertaining to recovery and fitness. And I definitely want you to send me those 10 principles. I can go over those. I might do a separate podcast on those down the road. But can you let my audience know where they can find you specifically if they have any questions for you and anything else that you want to tell my audience?
Yeah, the best way to find me, there's two ways. If you want to just contact me, do it through LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. You just have to request to connect, and as long as your request to connect is, hey, I heard you on Steve's podcast, on the TrulyFit podcast. I've got some questions. I'll send you a meeting link, and we'll set up a meeting. The other place you can go is my website. My website's called Train Recover Win. TrainRecoverWin.com. Go to trainrecoverwin.com. There's information there. My website is nascent. It's very young. It's evolving. But those are the two best places to find me.
I will put all that in the show notes. My guest today has been Don Moxley. Thanks for joining the TrulyFit Podcast.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity.